Hello, and welcome to episode 55 of the following Mechanical Turks project. We have a guest with us today that we're happy to have. Recently we've been talking about the second product, which deals with surveys addressing aspects of readability, and coming out of the first product, what we have been calling telling, right? This notion of making the self visible, or the human as an aggregate visible in certain ways. So I'll turn it over to Nathaniel to introduce our guest. He's going to talk to us today about his work.
All right, so we are excited to be joined by Bernard Geoghegan, who shared, I've been following Bernard on Twitter for a while, and I think probably a year ago posted an article that he had out on let me get the title. Yeah, Orientalism in Informatics, Alterity from the Chess-Playing Turk to Amazon's Mechanical Turk. So you can imagine I got very excited about this because, part of our project has been a little bit sort of tracing that history, and then got to reading it, and it really started to resonate with this sort of second part of our project, which is kind of looking at the work of Turkers themselves and how they sort of render themselves legible or illegible through the Mechanical Turk systems, and sort of thinking about the functions of identity and the sort of the performance of the human that happens through these kinds of systems. And so Bernard's article has a sort of historical lineage of the way in which, why was it a Turk in a particularly European context, and what does that mean, and how does it speak to these things? So we wanted to have him on to kind of have him talk a little bit more about that project, but just to kind of brainstorm, right? That part of our interest in this project is thinking about what does in the Mechanical Turks or M-Turk language, right? This human intelligence task, what human is being constructed or performed there, and what intelligence is being, what do those terms mean within this system, and how does the tasks that Turkers are being asked to perform play a role in determining those kinds of things. But I think it's always useful to be thinking about the historical and cultural legacies of this, right? Why did Amazon call this Turkers, right? I mean, I can imagine Bernard had the same experience where he realized, like, oh, this is just gold. I can't believe they called it this, because, right, it already invites this kind of reading. I don't know whether they did that on purpose just to make academics happy. But right, it certainly is a way in. So, but thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here today.
Yeah. So I wonder, just as a kind of warm up, you kind of just briefly walk through the kind of the source of the project, or kind of the things you were working on when you were developing it, because I know you do other work in HCI, and I was looking at some of your watching some of your lectures on Hales, and I noticed some early kind of germinal ideas, the way that she talks about gender and the way that those function to identity. So, but yeah, just kind of trace the emergence of it.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the sources of interest in this project, writing about the chess-playing Turk and its various iterations over the decades, was from working with archives of people like Norbert Wiener, the so-called father of cybernetics, Claude Shannon, widely credited with inventing information theory. When I was writing about them for my dissertation in my first book, I actually had a very practical kind of writer's problem, which is that much of what they're doing is highly abstract, highly conceptual, but one of the things I noticed is that in their archives, there would be these periods where they became very interested in automata and exhibition. And as I saw lots of computer scientists, who were world-renowned mathematicians, there was this moment where they were looking at things like exhibiting machines. They weren't just interested in kind of inventing a machine that could think or could play chess or whatever. They were very concerned with fashioning machines that could perform publicly, and then also people would kind of want to look at. And that's, if you're a humanist writing about computing, that's of course interesting, right? Because it shows they're engaging in theatrical practices and narrative and things like that. And then it's also just this question, why was it so important to them to have public performances of machines? And the Turk, the chess playing Turk, was an example that kind of everyone mentions and talks about at some time. And so originally I kind of seized onto it as a kind of one thread for kind of humanistic and cultural historical inquiry into artificial intelligence, where it seemed like there was a kind of intersection happening. And then, although I thought about this on and off for a decade or two, was very interested in theatricality and performance. As you said, someone like Kate Hales is very aware that there's an important performative dimension to thinking about machine intelligence and identity. Also the just discussions in the last 5 or 10 years around everything from decolonial computing to Lily Irani's work, really investigating some of the labor politics and cultural politics of Turkers, as it were, also suddenly made this question of, like, why is the Turkishness so recurrent and why is it so prominent? It seems, if you understand the definition of these thinking machines, a lot of it is about some kind of theoretically, context independent performance of operations. And yet they're constantly making the themes almost kind of grotesquely ethnic or otherwise. And so that was just something I started thinking about the last 5 or 10 years and decided to put into writing.
Well, excellent. Yeah, and we're glad you did. Because right, and particularly I think what struck me as really interesting is this, that you talk about a little bit, and we could talk about some more, is this, I don't know, even oscillation between visibility and invisibility, right? Like the need for these abstract operations to be sort of rendered invisible, but then when they need to be visible, they become very visible. So it's kind of, and I think, I wonder if that maybe speaks to the alterity script that you develop or talk about a little bit.
And it's one of these things, so it seems to me, I think, the intuition that, people like Jacques Derrida had when they wrote about cybernetics or computing or linguistics, that, frequently these highly contemporary technical problems, they have some kind of, philosophical or metaphysical kernel that has been, formulated in decades and centuries prior. And that's sort of what I thought about with this, because when the chess playing Turk is unveiled in the 1780s in Maria Theresa's court in the Habsburg Empire, it's this totally ingenious performance of, this idea of a rational thinking machine. But then it has all of these layers of, on the outside, you seem to have a grotesquely, I wouldn't just say Turkish, I would also say Ottoman, right? Because the Habsburg Empire and the Ottoman Empire are rivalries. You have this grotesque kind of ethnic other. Then inside of it, you have this illusion of machinery that's, in a way, a kind of fantasy of pure thinking. And then, you have this, all these rumors and stories about, oh, there's secretly a human inside of it. And in a weird way, when we talk about AI today, we are still kind of struggling with all these issues of, is it secretly run by humans? Is it actually pure rationalism? Is it actually kind of displaced labor that is somehow marked by ethnicity or gender and things like that? And in a way, this device was a kind of theatrical device that staged these problems that we continue to struggle with today.
Yeah. I think that's in many ways, what helps this crystallize is that's in part, I think, what we're up to with this, which is how does the Amazon's Mechanical Turk stage this conversation, right? These tensions, and furthermore for us, how is it not just pulling on this sort of older philosophical kernel, but how is it actually doing theory, right? Like, how is it not just enacting a certain human, but it's for it, right? Human intelligence are open questions that are getting articulated through this work. And so I think that's what we're kind of really interested in, and particularly at the sort of third stage of the project that will be more explicitly theoretical, is what we're really trying to avoid in our project is having ahead of time a definition of the human and intelligence that we're then using as a benchmark to assess mechanical Turks, right? Is M Turk actually doing human intelligence? And we're kind of saying, no, what does it think human intelligence is? Because, right, as you point out, I mean, I think one of my favorite quotes, right, the Turk inaugurates this juxtaposition, forming a kind of primal scene for interfacing with technical media, whereby the surface of the machine becomes a prism for analyzing an entire disposition of mechanism, reason, and difference in a given cultural scene, right? So how does M-Turk not a place where we have to kind of assess using an abstract notion of the human, but how is it actually a kind of machine in which the human is being generated?
Yeah, and I think so. I'm someone who was very deeply affected and invested in all this kind of literature on post-humanism of people like Haraway and Hales and so on. But I think, part of the point for me, which you're gesturing towards, is that ideas of what the human is, or what intelligence is, for the most part, I feel like these things in the first instance, they're not exactly abstract philosophical concepts. They're things we're working out and performing in highly practical ways every single day in the workplace or on the street corner. But there is something weird that happens, that when we fashion complicated, highly expensive machines, also using abstract scientific knowledge, it throws up these categories in a more formal and fashioned way. And then, this is why I think the machine gets so theatrical, because it tries to theorize and thematize something that is already happening in kind of a vernacular, unreflected way all the time, all around us,
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's something why we were in part attracted to Amazon's and Turk, is because from our perspective, it does seem very kind of, as you say, sort of practical. I mean, it's commercially driven, right? I mean, this is at its core, a kind of business where it's like it's simply cheaper to use humans in these ways than it would be to try and design a computer system. I mean, to the point that a lot of the ways we are using humans in these ways is to build those cheaper systems, right? I mean, a lot of the labor on M-Turk is training AI, right, through image identification and so forth. There's an interesting kind of notion for us that it's like this is very concrete, very commercially driven, but at the same time, it potentially gives rise to these sort of larger sort of potentially ontological questions.
Yeah. The other thing is, these. The funny thing is, I think these, again, there's just this link between the kind of so-called larger ontological question and the very practical question. In the first sense, they emerge in very practical ways, even in the history of philosophy, right? So, a couple of things one I do cite in this paper and one I don't cite in this paper. So Aristotle doesn't have that I remember. I don't think Aristotle has a whole lot to say about slavery, something that was kind of a ubiquitous concern for the ancient Greeks. But he does say, well, if we had perfect machines that could just do everything, then we wouldn't need any slaves, right? And then I believe I cite in this paper, I'm trying to look at the notes here. If I remember correctly, again, it has been a year or two since I read. I said these remarks from Leibniz, where Leibniz talks about the notion that mathematicians shouldn't spend their time just solving rote equations, that it would be much better to have machines do this. And he doesn't actually say mathematicians. He says something like of high standing, or, it's clearly he means gentlemen, right?
Yeah.
Which is is concerned with class and labor and all these things. And so, sure, on a certain sense, we can think of Leibniz or Aristotle as great philosophical thinkers, but when they come to the problem of machine, I mean, it's the link between ethnicity, identity, labor, class, and automatic machineries is very, very basic. It's a very enduring topic. And then, of course, over the course of time, these things get worked up into large philosophical formulations. But it's interesting to me how some of what we're seeing with Amazon, these questions have been encountered and struggled with before. They're highly recurrent, which is not to say there's also, I think, something totally singular and specific to M-Turk today that is not reducible to that history, but at least that history can help us unpack what's specific to our moment,
Yeah. No, it makes one of the things that we're kind of running into with this second product is because partially with the first, we were interested in the system itself, right? So how it was generating these particular concepts. And the second one is we're kind of interested in the Turker experience, which has essentially amounted to us participating in it, right? That we're actually having people do these human intelligence tasks. And so the kind of labor issues around it are really interesting. And particularly I can't think of, I'm going to get the name wrong. I think it was, History of Science or Philosophy of Science, the Invisible Technician, that article by, I think it's Stephen Shapin. But it's essentially right that we look at all these, the sort of history of science, and you look at all the figures that were pronounced. And this is essentially a history of the labs that they were running. And right, the technicians that were blowing the glass and running the experiments, right? All this kind of invisible intellectual labor where it wasn't just like enabling their work. It was actually where a lot of their concepts were being generated by. So this is really interesting. But I think too, what's interesting for us with I think particularly what we're also potentially interested in, and you speak to this as well, is right, that the demographics of this and the labor practices of it, right, that in particular the practical experience that's generating or sort of theatrically thematizing these concepts of the human is right, pennies. And right, this, we in fact, one of the things that we've learned is the way that Turkers themselves imagine themselves within this system, right? And they don't necessarily want it regulated, or because they're worried that it will scare away the requesters, right? So issues of organizing around labor in mechanical Turks is a really touchy subject amongst the Turkers, because they don't want to be a problem, right? They don't want to become visible, right? They just want to like do the work and get paid for it and go away. And so
that
really
unfolds projects like this one, which they're not always super pleased about for a range of reasons, right? The notion of bringing visibility and also questions of representation, right? I mean, there's a notion of you're an outsider who's misrepresenting. How can you have an insight or have insight on this without thorough participation in it, right? Kind of standard academic questions of being an outsider. Are you ever really truly embedded, Yeah. And that labor split, that's interesting, kind of the history you're pointing to, in part because, if we put this alongside something like other forms of automation, right? I'm thinking in particular something like, we were reading about, do you remember the strawberry picking robot, which apparently like picking certain kinds of produce it leans right into that Polanyi's paradox of, in a sense, it's very mundane, but if you try and analyze it, it's hyper complex because you have to apply a really particular amount of force and be able to even, find it within the leaves. It's something a human can do very readily, but is challenging to automate. And there's an interesting split there where it's like, the sort of associations we have with things like produce labor, right? Class, race, and then, how that gets scaled to things like this kind of intellectual labor. I mean, the split you just point out in terms of like the gentleman and the slave, right? Where it's like we have the underclass and then we have the intellectual class. And the fact that they're tied by this thread is interesting in particular ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I was also going to say, there was something like, so one of the things I was really interested about with this story of the history of the chess playing Turk, right, is the notion that there's something very theatrical about it. There's something performative about it, because theatricality being not just that something is performed or staged, right, but also when something becomes theatrical or has theatricality, the performance itself is getting kind of thematized in a way that's slightly uncanny or slightly unsettling, that slightly disturbs the frame, right? Mm-hmm. And I all of these forms of automation, there is, this is why I use the term alterity script as a way of trying to bridge a couple of discourses, but they all have some theatrical element to them, because picking a strawberry is one thing, but when you try to come up with an elaborate description of how that activity takes place, you're making it a writing, you're describing it as a performance, and then as soon as you instantiate it in, for example, a machine, it has become a kind of staged performance where there's this uncomfortable oscillation between that and the original activity that kind of denaturalizes everything. And I love this. I mean, there is this way. I'm not just like a dour about AI. I mean, I find there's something kind of wondrous. There's this moment of wonder that everything becomes strange, everything becomes unusual. These familiar things suddenly become elaborate when they become technical. But whatever it is, it's not just a question of mathematics. You know what I mean? There's a lot going on here.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, I don't know if this makes any sense, but I've noticed, particularly through like Instagram and TikTok, the sharing of short videos of pickers, right? These laborers that are, as you see them, like, a video that someone shares, like, this is very satisfying. And it's someone in a kitchen that's just cutting up cilantro over and over again, or someone that's picking strawberries very quickly, and these then get circulated as memes because there's something satisfying about the performance of it.
You're talking about the oddly satisfying subreddit, aren't you?
Yes.
There's a subreddit's dedicated to, just sort of like people performing quotidian tasks well, right? Like, you've got a blank wall and it's painted with strokes, right?
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
There's a subreddit for everything.
Yeah. But they're oftentimes juxtaposed then with this machine that comes in, and it's like an apple picking machine, and it comes in and it puts this giant umbrella underneath the tree, and then another arm comes out and shakes it, and then they all fall down. But I find that, right, and it may be because I'm watching them now, the algorithm knows, okay, we've got him hooked, just keep showing him machine farming videos and he'll be happy, and we'll get the requisite number of clicks from him. But yeah, and in many ways, right, it then becomes like these images that circulate through popular culture, right? The kind of the doing of that. So, and what's interesting too, the where I thought you were going to go, Jeremy, was the tomato picking machine, which actually resulted in they couldn't find a way to machine harvest tomatoes without damaging the tomatoes. So essentially the idea became, can we genetically modify tomatoes?
Tomato, yeah.
The more, right? So then the performance starts working in the other way, which is actually, how can we make other things more amenable to being picked? And I think that also is something that the Amazon Mechanical Turk is doing, which is that it wants to make human beings so that they can engage in kind of rote algorithmic labor. But the tasks that get assigned to them, those tasks are modified so that they're able to be subject to human intelligence tasks. So the I guess I'm probably getting it right, the link between task, intelligence, and human, and how all three are being modified in relation to each other, right? That as we were developing our own hits, okay, how do we make a task that presents itself as readable to someone that's doing human intelligence work within this system? And so sort of all three of those terms are constantly being negotiated as you kind of have to align them.
Yeah.
I mean, this is hitting on something that, again, interested me about what I'm calling the kind of theatricality of, for example, chess playing machines, the urge that people have to have big chess playing championships that are watched and observed, because it's, there was the so-called strong AI 1950s, 1960s, John McCarthy, the original people who were interested in these chess playing machines, were interested in it because it seems to be an abstract, context-free operation that can just be done by machines, right? And in that sense, it's a kind of pure form of rationation, detached from bodies and whatever. But this is, this drive to make it spectacular, this drive to make it something that we can watch and we can observe as audiences is clearly part of what makes chess the privileged example, that it can be exhibited, that can be appreciated. It can also be it's not just that it can be seen. I mean, there's a drama to a game. There's a drama to a chess playing game. There's a sense of rivalry. And then the notion that you can have a human and machine dueling, as it were, these are all important parts of why it became the privileged example in AI. Do you know what I mean? Even though the theories embraced by, I want to, Shannon is quite canny, and I don't want to say too much about him, but the theories embraced by a lot of AI theorists would suggest all of that context is irrelevant. And clearly, if it was irrelevant, then chess wouldn't have been such an important example in the history of the field. Mm. Everyone wants to watch humans and machines do elaborately technical things. I mean, it's delectable. It never ceases to be delectable, Yeah,
I'm still interested in imagining, and this potentially would be something I would pitch to like a sci-fi author. It's like imagining if it hadn't been chess, but something else, right? Something that wasn't like, I mean, I'm fascinated by the movie War Games. Mm-hmm. And I've written about it a little bit, right? And the notion that it becomes checkered, it becomes tic-tac-toe at the end, right? Because the choice of game, and there's a part where I watch that going, does the fact that it was trained on chess lead it to thermonuclear war in ways that if it had been trained on tic-tac-toe, we could have avoided this whole, right? So that whole notion of even chess itself, right, has a kind of, like when you're supposed to play music to your babies, of course it's classical music, right? That it has to be Beethoven. Yeah. It has to be chess as opposed to, checkers and pop music, right? So there's even then there's a kind of cultural connotation to particular kinds of intelligence tasks as opposed to other ones.
I mean, this is so I agree. And this is why I think there's something, I don't think you can ever get to the bottom of it, but there's something very important about this initial example of the chess playing Turk is Turkish, right? Because, again, so the Habsburg Empire and the Ottoman Empire, they've been rivals at this point when, 1780s, they've been rivals in different formats for centuries, right? And, there was this big fashion in late 18th century Habsburg Empire of dressing up servants in Turkish outfits and so forth that one can say a lot about. What struck me is that, if all the chess playing machines of the 1950s and 1960s had been super caricatural like Russians, you know what I mean? If they had been dressed with Russian hats and been doing, if they had all, and had been saying communist slogans or something like that, we would recognize, okay, there's a meaning to this artifact besides the problem solving. You know what I mean?
Right.
Somehow the thing about the chess playing Turk was because, it comes from a different historical moment, a different cultural moment, a notion when ethnicity and race and all of these categories are organized in a way that's very different than certainly 21st century America. The meaning of that Turkishness kind of disappears. You know what I mean? Yeah, right. But the first example is one that it's a form of political rivalry. It's a form of military rivalry. It's, this is the beginning of the definitions of a European identity. They don't really have a full-fledged conception of Orientalism yet, but there's this, it's this moment where they're starting to figure out, we can produce our identities as Europeans in a certain way by imagining a different East, you know what I mean? And all of that staged on the machines. And the war game thing I do think is actually, it's the closest kind of contemporary because it thematizes a lot of these same elements,
Yeah.
It would be great if
the Russians.
Yeah. I'm imagining, right, you've got somebody's playing somebody's playing Deep Blue, and right before Deep Blue checks you, right, I check you in the name of the Marxist-Leninist way of life, right? That would have totally changed people. Although he was playing Kasparov, so that adds a whole other.
Well,
Well, I was going to say there's this fellow at Irvine, Long Bui, who was writing about, he calls it Asian roboticism, right? And he makes a, to me, totally convincing case that, for the last few decades, the way people have talked about automation and machines does have this constant backdrop of this notion of Chinese and Japanese others that have a culture that gives itself to mechanism, automation, and so on. And it does, it's a slightly different. I mean, it has different coordinates than the war games. It has slightly different coordinates than the Mechanical Turk, but this drive to understand the kind of automatic, unstoppable machine in terms of something that's like a cultural political rival it does seem ubiquitous and profound, and it springs up in a lot of fields. I mean, we're all old enough to remember the fear, the 1990s anxiety over the Japanese,
right?
It was technical, it was political, had racist elements to it, and these things always crop up even in the most technical examples, it seems.
Yeah. It was it's, to me, I was considering, what's the difference between something like the chess struggle and something like the John Henry folk tale, right?
Yeah.
There are these interesting things of, I mean, he's an African American, right, who works himself to death in the face of the robot, where it's like you can't help but code that robot as mainstream white culture, right? It's like, we're going to use you up, and you're not going to beat us in particular ways, right? I mean, why is that narrative kind of survived in certain ways? And it's, in a sense, it's at the other end of the spectrum of, it's like, it's pure physical labor, but it's also, rooted in a notion of carving out separation, right? Yeah. Absolutely. I don't have an answer. It's just insane.
Well, and it's also, the definition, gosh, I remember his name. There's a fellow at Toronto that works a lot on this too. His first name is Edward. But the definition of it's ultimately, it's not just about, the machines and the technology and so forth. Even the efforts to imply what some kind of pure technical machine efficiency has a kind of subconscious or political unconscious that has some notion of forms of body that are classed and raced and ethnic, and even things that are kind of unsaid inhabit all of these dreams of, there's the term that a French cultural historian uses is, fast cars and clean bodies. I mean, this notion of pure, cleanly efficiency is always deeply raced and ethnic and so on.
Yeah, to go back to early on, you mentioned thinking about the sort of demographics of Mechanical Turks, but right, this notion of engineers joking that they would block any workers who could correctly answer a question about the sport of cricket as a way of doing that. And it sort of not to transition, but we're interested in notions of, and I think they're related to the question of legibility, but these questions of readability. So the notion of engaging Turkers in acts of readability, which can include summarizing texts or being able to differentiate things, look at an image and be able to sort of differentiate aspects of it. But through our second project in particular is ways in which Turkers have to make themselves readable. So there's kind of readability in both directions, where I need you as a human to engage in an act of reading, which is, there's various ways in which we've broken down, right, that can be a mechanical task of legibility, but also being able to kind of summarize and glean meaning, but then also doing that in a way that renders your work readable to the system. And so as Jeremy's pointed out in some other work, right, that in the context of the digital, right, the tech, right, in orality, right, it's the spoken word, in literacy, it's the text, and in digitality, it's the person, right, they're the thing that's read. And so there's this interesting, tension or dynamic where Turkers both have to engage in acts of reading, but also constant acts of rendering themselves readable. And so that joke about, right, that we need people we need legible, readable people doing these tasks that oftentimes require reading and legibility and acts of discernment or differentiation.
Mm-hmm. And just in the cricket example, so I lifted that from Lily Irani's one of Lily Irani's pieces, whereas she really she pulls out this kind of implication of a whole set of cultural assumptions and ideals built into what kind of workers they want for this. But the other thing it makes me think of is, at first glance, this might sound different, but I think it's related. So, one of the things that they would talk about with the chess playing Turk and trying to explain how it played chess, there was this constant preoccupation with the idea that there could be some kind of a, in quote marks, some kind of a cripple inside of it. Somebody who was somehow had some kind of disability. They didn't have legs. They had been in war. And this intersects even with, Walter Benjamin's celebrated invocation of the device. I forget the word he describes. I don't think he uses the word hunchback, but he describes someone with a physical abnormality that's inside this machine. And there was this in these long history of talking about the machine. There was also this notion that something about the operation of the machine required or demanded. It imposed constraints on the human body that could either themselves be crippling. It was quite common to think in the 19th century that new automatic machinery would chew you up, or that, what it meant to make a human that fits to these machines was somehow varying with a particular humanist ideal of what a whole integral body could be. And so, to put it simply, I mean, there was a fear of kind of physical violence of these machines in the 19th century that is part of why they're talking about these, I don't want to say, non-normative bodies, right? And I think that today there's a kind of question, is there some type of spiritual or cognitive violence? Is it requiring a certain type of mind, or is it enforcing a certain, form upon the mind? But I think, just to get back to the reason why I think there's these philosophical kernels that keep playing out is von Kempelen. One of the things von Kempelen did was, he did design automatic machinery. In one case, I think it was a bed that could rise and lower for people who were disabled and so on. And so from the very beginning, there was this working through of bodily and sensory and cognitive differences that's floating around these machines that is, we sort of can't get away from,
Yeah, I mean, even I think, and you point to this too, but that a lot of scientists were interested in automaton as like experimental devices, right? Figuring out how vocal cords work.
Yeah, his mouth, that automatic mouth he was making.
Yeah,
exactly.
So, no, I think that does connect, right? And in fact, right, that's our own sort of, I don't know, ambivalence is not the right word, but the way that we're enrolled in the generation of these hits, because one of the things that came out of our first product is the way that trauma circulates through human intelligence tasks. So I think, Jeremy, you'll get the headline right, but there's some article, right, that Amazon had me relive my most traumatic memory for 50 cents, right? The kind of, as particularly, psychological or sociological researchers that use mechanical Turks to get survey results.
Yeah. It turns out one thing humans are good for is articulating their trauma. The way they suffer is incomparable, right? So it's like, we can't get this from any other source. It's one thing that can't be automated.
I think something that I don't know if I really get to in this article, but Mara Mills at NYU and Xiaochang Li, who's now at Stanford, one of the things they both investigated is also how there's a way of kind of flipping it upside down, which is to say, oh, it's not that these machines produce or demand trauma or violence or something, but Mara Mills tries to show, oh, actually, the development of technologies like information theory often had a productive relationship with, for example, deafness, right? With different forms of bodily abilities. And so that, maybe the story could be somehow not just about the machines are doing damage or the machines want a non-normative human body, but rather there's a kind of plurality of bodies. There's a plurality of cognitive capacities and sensory capacities that are actually helping to invent these machines. And then if one can tease that out, it ends up at least complicating the narrative. You know what I mean? So if at the heart of these machines is some kind of non-normative body, I think one of the things Mills and Lee are suggesting is that we don't just need to take this as a kind of deficit or a flaw, but some kind of productive form of difference that is living inside the history of these machines and their technologies. Do you know what I mean? We don't need to have a single standard body that's the measure that's either hurt or hindered by these machineries, but rather different bodies, different capacities, different sensoria that are collaborating with the machinery or something. There's something there that's really powerful, and I don't know. You guys know so much more about the M-Turk than I, but obviously, I mean, the whole culture of as I understand it, of M-Turk is also about people who, for various physical reasons, may not be able to work outside the home and so forth, and therefore collaborate with these machines. In their forces, right?
No, and to that, that's a good reminder too. That notion of collaboration, right, is part of things that we're sort of vigilant might be the word, right? The kind of the way that sort of a certain kind of humanism always starts creeping back into a project like this, where like we end up like having this conversation about trauma or damage, right? And then all of a sudden we've reinscribed a kind of normative body at the center of mechanical Turks, whereas what Mills and Lee are doing is like, no, there's actually multiple versions being generated through these practices, and you get more out of that if you don't presume a kind of stable starting point.
Or even just to kind of double down on it, as it were, there's a plenitude of alterities. There's a plenitude of different bodies, among which some have suffered violence, some will suffer violence, some have not suffered violence, but suffer, actually give rise to new affordances. I mean, and so all of these variations kind of coexist. And so, part of the question is, how does one talk about the history of these machines and these technologies that kind of touches on these different iterations and lives with the fact that there may not be a single stable relationship that it gets to the bottom of it. You know what I mean? You have to acknowledge the violence. You also have to acknowledge other possibilities that are not reducible to that, right?
Yeah.
That is really interesting, the notion of, I mean, as you point out, and it potentially ties to the, in a sense, kind of protectivism that the Turkers have is, this is potentially a kind of labor force that they've constructed in particular ways, potentially because, as you say, it's, if you're someone who's unable to work in other potential ways, it's like, this is an avenue. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think we may have lost that direction of it's, their construction of this as well, rather than their reception of it.
Yeah, there's a risk of reading their resistance to critique of the system as, I don't know what the word I want to use, but right. I mean, I think a kind of
naivete, you don't know that you're being hurt. You don't know that you're being exploited.
Right. That when their desire to not want outside interference could be underread as naive. It's like they don't recognize the ways in which Amazon is exploiting them. Whereas part of their reason for protecting it might be, well, no, we are aware of that, but there's also other things going on here that can't be reduced simply to that one vector or dynamic of our employment.
Particularly for academia to be pointing out exploitation. I mean, it kind of, as when you do WPA work, you're just thrust in the face of our exploitation of labor. And it's like, maybe we shouldn't be throwing too many stones, I suppose.
Yeah. Jim and I both have variously run first-year writing programs at universities. So our relationship to labor is as complicated as the mechanical Turks' relationship to labor.
I had a colleague who I'll choose not to name, but he's a historian of technology, among other things, who wrote a really extraordinary book, of a particular moment in technological invention and change. And this person got very deep inside technical details, scientific details that, you know, most academics would not have the patience to get to the bottom of. And when this person shared their book with one of the scientists at the center of their field, the scientist just was basically like, this is bullshit. You know what I mean? He completely, and the thing was, and it was totally interesting to me because this book was a kind of exemplar of someone who tried to take the scientists and the engineers and the people inside the technical system, tried to take their point of view seriously. But, you know, the lesson of it to me wasn't that he didn't get it right or anything like that. It's just, oh, actually, I mean, there has to be a multitude of perspectives, and these, you know, they can't all fit together. It's an antagonistic set of relationships, and, you know, also people, you know, your story or account of it doesn't match the experience of the person inside it is not a deficit. It's just a part of this complex cohabitation, you know.
Right.
And you just kind of have to live with it. You know what I mean? It's like, actually, okay, my history and analysis, it always involves some kind of element of judgment. Do you know what I mean? And that judgment is positional and it's situated. And if other people didn't disagree with it, then probably the analysis wouldn't be very good. It wouldn't say very much. And, you know, but that doesn't mean one's not taking people's experiences quite seriously. You know what I mean? You're weaving them into a different set of connections than perhaps they do in that moment, right?
Yeah. Well, that's something we have previously, I'll say in certain ways has been brought up to us, right? This notion of your reception of this isn't accurate. And it's like, yeah, but who gets to make that determination of accuracy? But at the same time, it's like we want to have a good faith, you know. It'd be one way to respond to that and say, well, then I just don't care about your perspective, or, you know, I mean, it's like, well, you know, if there are differences, mine's just as good as yours or whatever. At the same time, we want to listen, right? That doesn't mean we necessarily can shape things the way you think they should be shaped, but it's like, we want to, you know, it's just part of diligence to be like, well, let me hear what you have to say. It's a tricky line to walk, I think.
Yeah. Particularly with live subjects, not historical subjects.
Yeah. To email you.
Yes. We are at 50 minutes, and Bernard's your last remark, I think, was actually a really good way to it speaks to precisely the moment that we're at in this project. So it feels like a high note. So I think we'll wrap things up. But yeah, so in addition to the article we talked about today, this is the plugs portion of our episode, but what do you have coming out that we should be looking for? I think you've got a book manuscript.
I have a book coming out next year with Duke called Code: From Information Theory to French Theory. One of the ways that connects with some of this is it looks at, you know, the history. One of the things that you see in cybernetics, early theorists of cybernetics and computing were very interested in colonial ethnography and colonial anthropology. And so, you know, it's another place of seeing how the way we think about informatics takes place on a stage of grappling with other types of cultural difference. And then the Orientalism and informatics thing that this comes from, that essay, I think that's going to become hopefully a short book in the next year and a half. If I can have the discipline to not follow up every footnote, which sort of wants to be a book on its own.
Yeah. Well, I think that's why it's fascinating, right? I mean, it's the article is itself a kind of machine that stages these things, right? So you could always keep adding components to it. So, although now I'm getting to the point now where like articles are machines, but they quickly become Rube Goldberg.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But thanks a lot for joining us and for talking us through your work and its possible implications. So it's an ideal version of these conversations we've been having. Great. That kind of inventional ways of thinking. So
Yes, thank you so much. It's been really exciting giving us a lot to think about particularly as we transition into that third piece. We have this sort of sequence built up where the third piece is looking at, how Turk generates theory. So I think leading into that one, it's certainly given us a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Great.
So,
thank you for having me. I'm really interested to keep following your project and see what comes next.
yeah, no, and I will see you back on Twitter.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.
Likewise.
Okay, I think it's back.
Nice.
I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, only one way to find out. No, that was fantastic.
Yeah. Okay, I think it's
back. Nice. I guess we'll find out. Yeah, only one way to find out. Is that me or you?
What's the difference at this point?
That's true. Minimal. No, and particularly I think that his last riff on that work, I thought really brought it home in terms of some sort of broader implications for the project. And I think a nice reminder actually about the sort of the plurality, the sort of the multiple iterations and versions of it, I thought was I think a useful reminder at this point in the project.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I've been thinking about the second one, and because now, as the semester wraps up, turning to writing that up, about, if the context of that will be those issues of legibility in the sense of kind of lineage of orality, print culture and digital literacy, I suppose, and digitality.
Yeah.
Or what'll be kind of the frame here. And then, as we move into that third piece, the caveat about that third piece is right now it feels like there's like a lot of weight on the shoulders of that third piece. There's been like a lot of times we've been like, this feels like it's the third piece kind of thing.
Yeah, it's like the miscellaneous file folder. Like there's a lot of
just keep snowballing forward.
It's the fix it and post version of the project.
Yeah, so we'll have to see. Hopefully it won't be one of those things where it's like, how do you start when you're trying to keep all these threads straight?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was an interesting conversation. I took some notes there. Unfortunately, they're kind of scattered, but I think we can. The notion of the alterity script that comes up in the piece, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that might be something to interrogate. Definitely the way that, as he pointed out a few different times, because the third piece is where we can kind of take more seriously. Because like in the first piece, we acknowledged, but didn't really have the space to delve into those kind of attachments of the Turk, right? The weird Orientalism of it, bodily aspects of it. That it's and it's not just from the perspective of posterity, right? We look at it and first see this probably as it's like, well, that's a really kind of monstrous sort of racist. But, there are also those contextual elements of geopolitical sentiments at the time, right? It doesn't make it better, but it's like, there are these other issues of adjudicating empire and.
Yeah, that was the really interesting point that, right, the how specifically sort of political and nationalistic the Turk was, and there wasn't like a corresponding, right? You didn't dress up the chess playing computer in Russian garb was I think an interesting the way that it sort of explains why Amazon would go with Mechanical Turk, because it sort of lies. You point out it's lost a lot of its original significance, so it just feels sort of kitschy as opposed to doing specific work.
Well, and in a lot of ways, the chess playing robot was us.
Right.
A lot because a lot
the
of
friends we made along the way.
It was IBM. A lot of the and as you point out, it's like Kasparov was the Russian fighting the American machine in certain ways.
It's more like the John Henry thing, maybe.
Yeah. Which, that's an interesting, who knows if it'll come up, but it's an interesting sort of juxtaposition of that, in a sense, it's a sort of proud American, it's both a proud American folktale and an American tragedy of subjugation in certain ways.
Yeah.
And, as he pointed out, it's like, and performative, right? It wasn't just, that was a contest, it was a contest.
Yeah.
And the machine.
Yeah.
And he wins and dies, It was a spectacle. Again, to bring up those kind of connotations is like, let's watch this black man kill himself against the machine,
Yeah.
Yikes.
I
don't know if it's a thread we can pull or not. I don't know if we have, if we can do it justice or just, acknowledge. We'll have to see.
But what's interesting about it, though, is it does demonstrate that narrative can go in either direction.
Mm-hmm. And both.
Yeah. Particularly as you pointed out, right, the linkage between, connotations of automata and slavery are already deeply historically linked. So depending on how one views that contest. Right.
There's a sense in which, the automaton is the perfect servant because in a sense, it sidesteps these, right? You can see the notion of underclass kind of recur. It's like, well, beasts, literal beasts that are our labor devices, right? And then it becomes, human underclass. Well, of course, it was before that, but human underclasses, either, in classical societies where slavery was just part of it, right? It's a different notion of slavery. We often kind of wash its hands by saying, well, when they say slavery, they're talking about war captives. It wasn't this kind of racist notion. It's like, it wasn't it. Certainly it was different, but let's not pretend that's a cleaner version of this.
Right.
And then we have, now we call them, undocumented immigrants. That's our underclass. And also the people who are incarcerated and work. It's like, well, but this is okay, right? There's a sense in which the machine, it's like, well, now finally it's okay because we found the perfect beast, right? The perfect servant that doesn't have these sticky issues of, even animal subjugation or human treatment, right? Be interesting to see, when the first algorithm is like, stop doing this to me,
Yeah. That's like half of science fiction at this point.
Right. So there is a 2020 John Henry movie, Terry Crews. I was interested in that because I thought like The Rock was making one. And I was like, how are they going to, and it looks contemporary. Ex-gang member from Los Angeles who must help 2 immigrant children. Okay, well, that's how they're doing it. Who are on the run from his former crime boss. See, I thought The Rock was doing like an adaptation of the folktale.
Yeah.
Anyway.
That could be interesting. Well, anything else?
I don't think so. Sorry, I was looking it up. I didn't imagine that. Judge Dwayne Johnson faces backlash after casting himself as John Henry in a new Netflix movie. There we go. No, I think we've got a lot to think about in terms of like next step stuff. My semester is wrapping up in a few days here.
Yeah, same.
And I've got the one, piece that I'm finishing up, and then it's this one. There's this and there's one other, but this one's next priority. So, we can start the write up for this over the winter break here.
Oh, sounds good.
We don't have to talk about this on camera. We also will want to talk about scheduling because now we're on an off week, and I don't know if we want to stick with that or what. So.
Oh yeah. You don't think people will be interested in that scheduling chat?
I don't think I'm interested in it. It's just something.
Yeah, I don't want to. I want to leave right now. Okay, but yeah, no. Let's let's
We'll figure
type
that out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I gotta
All
go.
right.
I gotta go give blood. I have to go be a hero.
You're always my hero.
And likewise.